take this issue very seriously. This is not merely about the past. This is about the possibility for ordinary human beings to have a future. Thanks very much.
I thank you, Vijay, for bringing us back to this trip, the history of colonialism. I'm particularly impressed by your point when you say that education in the history is very important for non-repetition of those horrendous crimes we just very briefly enumerated. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to our panelist, distinguished ambassador of Grenada in New York, the permanent representative of Grenada to the United Nations in New York, who is also the chairperson of the Special Committee on Decolonization since 2019. Prior to her appointment as ambassador and the permanent representative in New York, Keisha Anya McGeer was an attorney and represented clients in different litigations on securities, product liability, and other complex commercial issues. She has conducted statutory and case law research at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. She holds a Juris Doctor from Cornell University and Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Miami, Florida, and an associate degree in law, economics, and mathematics from Barbados Community College in Saint Michel, Barbados. Your Excellency, you have the floor. Please welcome Ambassador Keisha Anya McGeer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Ambassador Chenju, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to this side event on the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. It is my honor as the chair of the Special Committee on Decolonization at the United Nations to participate and deliver these remarks in this panel discussion. As a whole, decolonization remains one of the main historic achievements of the United Nations to date. When the UN was established, 750 million people, almost a third of the world's population at the time, lived in territories that were non-self-governing, dependent on colonial powers. Since then, more than 80 former colonies have gained their independence, and other territories chose free association or integration with an independent state. These facts indeed demonstrate the great progress thus far made on decolonization front. But here's the key, and a fact we must keep at the forefront of our minds. Today, there still remains 17 territories on the UN's list of non-self-governing territories. If one message rings true following today's panel discussion, I hope that it will be that we must continue to reinvigorate the self-determination process on a case-by-case basis with a sense of urgency. I am convinced that only by us all working together and joining our efforts will we be able to drive the decolonization mandate forward. We must be creative, pragmatic, and of course, all while respecting the mandate of and commitments member states have made towards achieving the ultimate goal of bringing colonialism to a speedy and unconditional end. Allow me to first take you on a bit of a journey of the decolonization process and how exactly the United Nations fits into that picture. And I'll also speak a bit on the role of the Special Committee on Decolonization, which I have the honor to currently chair. If the numbers to which I just referred prove anything, it is that the role of the United Nations in decolonization is undeniable. At the core, the decolonization efforts of the United Nations derive from the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. And that is provided for in Article 1.2 of the UN Charter. In fact, the Charter contains 3 specific chapters, chapters 11, 12, and 13 devoted to trusts and non-self-governing territories. Also in chapter 11 of the Charter, provides the principles to ensure that the interests and the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories are protected and promoted by member states which administer those territories, which we refer to at the United Nations as administering powers. Today, the process by which the peoples of these territories exercise their right to self-determination to decide the future status of their homeland is known as decolonization. And one clarifying fact that I always find important to remind folks is that self-determination is not synonymous with independence exclusively. There are other forms of self-determination defined by the United Nations, which I will touch on shortly. In the UN Charter, a non-self-governing territory is actually defined as a territory whose peoples have not yet attained a full measure of self-government. The administering powers recognize the principle that the interests of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount and accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost the well-being of the inhabitants of the non-self-governing territories. To this end, the administering powers, among other things, accept to develop self-government, to take due account of the political aspirations of the peoples, and to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions according to the particular circumstances of each territory, and to transmit to the UN information on conditions in those territories. In 1960, the GA adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, known also as the Declaration on Decolonization, by which the General Assembly proclaimed the necessity of bringing colonialism in all its forms and manifestations to a speedy and unconditional end, and to this end declared, among other things, that all people have a right to self-determination, and by the virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. By its resolution 1541, 15 of 1960, the GA set up the principles which should guide members in determining whether or not an obligation existed to transmit the information under Article 73E of the Charter, and decided that such principles should be applied in light of the facts and circumstances of each case. And as I alluded to earlier, there are more than one category in which a non-self-governing territory can be said to have reached a full measure of self-government, and considered having implemented the right of self-determination by its people. And that may include: 1, becoming a sovereign independent state; 2, free association with an independent state; 3, integration with an independent state; or 4, any other political status freely determined by a people. Let me now turn to the Special Committee on Decolonization, or as many know it better as the C24. As some background, the C24 was established in 1961 by the General Assembly and is a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly devoted to the issue of decolonization. The C24's mandate comprises of 2 main actions. 1, examining the application of the Declaration on Decolonization. And 2, making suggestions and recommendations on the progress and extent of the implementation of the Declaration. The C24 has been meeting annually since 1962. It makes recommendations to the General Assembly through the 4th Committee, the Special Political and Decolonization Committee. The Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, also considers the question of the implementation of the Declaration on Decolonization by the specialized agencies and the international institutions associated with the UN. The GA annually requests the C24 to continue to seek suitable means for the immediate and full implementation of the Declaration on Decolonization, and to carry out the actions approved by the General Assembly. And that includes dispatching visiting missions to the non-self-governing territories on a case-by-case basis and conducting seminars on decolonization. In a series of its resolutions, the GA has reaffirmed that visiting missions, where applicable, are an effective means of ascertaining the situation of the peoples in the territories in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions on specific territories. Distinguished guests here today, I also want to touch a little bit on the International Decade for the Eradication of Colonialism. The eradication of colonialism continues to be one of the priorities of the United Nations. It is a collective task that calls for the active involvement of all concerned. The General Assembly, by its annual resolution on the implementation of the Declaration, reaffirms that the existence of colonialism is incompatible with the Charter, the Declaration on Decolonization, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By its Resolution 75-123 of December 2020, the GA declared the period 2021 through 2030 the fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism. It is important to further strengthen the renewed momentum generated in recent years. Strengthen dialogue and cooperation between all actors is paramount in devising ways of moving the decolonization agenda forward. In discharging its mandate, the special committee is guided by the principles set out in the Charter of the UN and all relevant GA resolutions. As the chair of the C24, I would like to reiterate our commitment to taking an action-oriented approach. I strongly believe that the C24 could achieve concrete outcomes by strengthening dialogue and cooperation among all stakeholders, in particular, the non-self-governing territories and the administering powers, and by continuing to devise creative and practical approaches on a case-by-case basis. In concluding, I reaffirm the C24's readiness to engage all to help advance the decolonization agenda in accordance with the principles set out in the Charter and the relevant resolutions on decolonization. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I would like just to stress two messages from your rich presentation. The one which impressed me, that peoples should freely determine their status, and that the other one, that the international community should reinvigorate the self-determination process to put a full end of the colonization which still exists with us. Our next speaker, Professor of Wuhan University School of Law, Shangguan Hong. He is one of the founders and the director of Wuhan University Institute for Human Rights Studies. As the director of Wuhan University Public Interest and Development Law Institute, Professor Shang focuses on the social justice and human rights issues related to economic development and globalization. Recently, he started conducting a research project on accountability in international business operations as research chair of the prestigious Wuhan University Institute of International Law. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your moderation and very kind introduction. And I learned a lot from the previous two speakers. I think the Ambassador Maguire have a wonderful presentation, and also I learned from the Mr. Vajja Parashat. We always can learn a lot from the historians. No, but I'm a lawyer, so I will discuss this colonialism from the legal side and from the economic side, from economic dimension. The economic globalization is an important dimension of the globalization process, and the different narratives and ideologies, i.e. globalism, have shaped different perceptions regarding economic globalization. Over the past 500 years, colonialism has been entwined with global economic advancement. However, the negative consequences of colonialism in the process of economic globalization, such as worldwide inequality and injustice, have been selectively ignored due to the dominant discourse of imperial globalism, championed by the colonial powers for a long time. Everybody wins is constructed as a primary reality of economic globalization. Yet a proper perception of the negative impact of European and North American countries on economic globalization through colonialism and its legacies is a prerequisite for solution of global inequality. Although since the global financial crisis in 2008, there has been a growing area of non-mainstream theories and approaches to expose the the negative consequences of colonialism on economic globalization. Together with international organizations and NGOs, including the UN, actively assessing and addressing the negative impact of colonialism on the economies and the societies of non-Western countries, particularly in terms of human rights. These voices remain marginalized and fragmented. Against the prevailing backdrop, the international community still needs to redouble its collective efforts to comprehend, threaten, and challenge the enjoyment of human rights through economic globalization, and on that basis, work together to shape a more just and equitable and sustainable human rights economy. A retrospective look at history, just as Vijay Pasha did, reveals that the history of economic globalization is also, to some extent, the history of colonial expansion. The global spread of European colonialism 500 years ago is one of the root causes, just as the moderator just said, we should explore the root causes. This global spread of European colonialism 500 years ago is one of the root causes of present-day global inequality and the North-South divide. The invasion of the sovereignty of colonies and the imperialist colonization seeking to plunder resources and expand territory has been perpetuated on a worldwide scale, and this flagrant aggression and violation has been described as a process of so-called civilization, according to the discourse of imperial globalism. It was only after the Second World War and that the direct rule of the colonies by European and North American powers came to an end successively. Nevertheless, to date, there are still at least 17 non-self-governing territories under colonial rule across the globe. And the social conditions in the non-self-governing territories are deteriorating as a result of the control and intervention of some colonizers. Corresponding to the post-World War II changes in the world situation, colonialism has also upgraded and evolved from a tangible direct domination to an invisible indirect domination. In other words, the continuation of the colonial domination worldwide through a construction of a global value, global rule, serving national interest and supporting the global expansion of transnational corporations. One of the typical examples of the continuation of colonialism is a liberal-centered international economic order introduced by the Western powers. The liberal international economic order, with investment facilitation, trade simplification, and deregulation at its core, is essentially an act of complicity in the imperialist plundering of natural resources of third world country, and is the underlying cause of the imbalances in economic globalization, as well as the lasting governing gap in business and human rights issues. In the case of a multilateral trading system, for example, the World Trade Organization, the WTO system, which was created under the leadership of Europe and the United States, uses the universal standards of industrialized countries to measure countries at different stages of development and places them in a homogeneous standing point, which is tantamount to restricting the global trade. Studies from economics has proven that free trade not only does not benefit everyone, but also has a potential to worsen the situation of people in developing countries. The lack of genuine democracy in the WTO machinery not only makes it difficult for civil society to participate effectively in its decision-making and dispute settlement process, but also for developing and less developed countries to participate on an equal footing in WTO affairs. Although the WTO has applied a series of sort of special and different treatment provisions to increase trade opportunities for developing countries, such provisions do not fundamentally address the development capacity of developing countries, but rather benefit the architects of the rule, the West. Relevant studies in international human rights law also amply illustrate how the WTO regime negatively affects fundamental human rights such as freedom from poverty, the right to development, the right to health, and the right to food by limiting national policy space. In addition, the labor classes in WTO reform failed because the international community and the academic circles promptly exposed the potential threats from these classes in the name of human rights. Therefore, in the context of the in-depth development of economic globalization, it is necessary for us to comprehensively examine the critically look at how colonialism and its legacy affect the formulation and operation of global economic rules. Due to the limitation of time, I will not give more example. I prepared to in the emerging global supply chain legislation, but we can discuss that later. While colonialism continues a new international economic order by the United Nations General Assembly in 1974, the Declaration on the Rights to Development in 1986, the Vienna Declaration and the Program of Action in 1993, the establishment of Working Group on Right to Development in 1998, and the gradual establishment of the right to development as internationally recognized fundamental human rights. The Human Rights Council established the working group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises, and developed several draft international instruments on business and human rights, led by the members from developing countries in 2014. The UN General Assembly adopted the resolution on unilateral economic measures as a means of political and economic coercion against the developing countries in 2021. The Human Rights Council adopted the resolution on the negative impact of the legacy of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights in 2021, and so on. It is easy to of colonialism has become one of the party of United Nations, just as Ambassador Kesha Maguire mentioned, and that developing countries are becoming the more active and proactive in participating in global governance, and are taking the lead in some issues. In concluding, against the background of growing globalization of production and the advancement of a global supply chain system, the comprehensive strength of developing countries, especially emerging economies, has rapidly increased, and non-Western countries once again are given the opportunity to build a more just and reasonable international legal order. The development of anti-colonialism is the United Nations has also laid the foundation for shaking the rule discourse of Western countries in economic globalization. In the current context, countries from the global South should practice multilateralism, firmly uphold the international system with the United Nations and its core, and the international order based on international law, participating the construction of an international economic order in the common interest of mankind. Thank you very much.
I thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shangguan Hong, for your insight in economic development and globalization and their interconnection with the consequences of colonialism. It was also important to hear from you how the World Trade Organization existing procedures may have a negative effect on the enjoyment of very important human rights. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to our next panelist. It will be Mr. Benedict Abrahamson Chigara, who is Professor of Public Law, College of Law, Qatar University. He is a member of a number of educational and research institutions in the United Kingdom. He's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the United Kingdom. He served as a full professor of law in London for 17 years and also lectured over many years and other universities in the United Kingdom, including Warwick, Leeds, and Oxford Brookes. He published several peer-reviewed research monographs, over 30 reviewed journal articles, and several book chapters and expert entries in prestigious peer-reviewed publications. You have the floor, sir.
That's very generous of you. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. I wonder if they actually refer to myself. The aim of my brief presentation, colleagues, this afternoon is to generate some thoughts for further discussion regarding the critical issues on the legacy of colonialism and the evolving UN Human Rights Project, particularly how unresolved colonial legacies can blight and undermine human rights guarantees under international law. Please allow me to preface my remarks by emphasizing 2 points. The first is that the idea of international human rights law is still evolving, both normatively and procedurally. The job is ongoing. This continual evolution of the human rights regime still appears to sustain an original difficulty with the idea of human rights, namely, what is a human right? Or to borrow from positivist language, it appears to still carry that challenge of what is the province of human rights, properly so called. Initially, when the international human rights regime began to evolve, this challenge resulted immediately in 2 views that are typified by the 1966 International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. These covenants, these 2 covenants reflect the East-West divide on the matter of what is a human right, so properly called. The second point I want to preface my presentation with is that the effort to sustain the evolution of the International Human Rights Project carries an enormous, a gigantic responsibility to be exemplary, particularly among those states that seek to champion human rights protection. This is because the international legal system is predominantly consent-based, and practice of our human rights champions can impact significantly both on the internal and the external legitimacy of the human rights project, whoever the onlookers are, whether they are other states who may feel discouraged or encouraged, or scholars are seeking to theorize this evolving system. And the effort to sustain the evolution of the human rights project also carries enormous risks, particularly because empirical evidence to date shows that, among other things, the protection of international human rights could be stronger. It is no exaggeration that today, state practice remains acutely very distant from the ideals and the hope of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, particularly when we look at the enforcement mechanisms that support the stock of core human rights treaties that have been established to date under the mandate of the United Nations. Poor norm enforcement begs the question of the responsibility of our human rights champions, those states that prioritize, that sing human rights, particularly in relation to challenges around the unresolved legacy of colonialism and its impact on human rights protection among Southern African development community states. You see, the dominant colonial legacy among Southern African development community states is that of racialization of land ownership, access to land, and land use. This remains the dominant and most compelling colonial legacy that has hindered Southern African development states' potential regarding the realization of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other UN human rights scorecards. You see, colonial administrations of these Southern African development community states had ruthlessly and methodically racialized access to land. And it became the rallying point, this racialization of access to land inevitably became the rallying point for why indigenous populations in this sub-region of Africa had to resort to waging civil wars against their colonizers for one common purpose, that of recovering their stolen lands. And the armed liberation struggles against colonial administrations by Umkhonto we Sizwe in South Africa, by SWAPO in Namibia, Frelimo in Mozambique, MPLA in Angola, ZANLA and ZIPRA in Zimbabwe. These armed liberation struggles were supported materially and politically by pro-human rights countries that championed the principle of right to self-determination. Colonial land expropriation therefore motivated these struggles for independence. In Zimbabwe, the war to end the dehumanizing racialization of access to land lasted 16 years, culminating in the Lancaster House Agreement at London in 1979. That agreement in London in 1979 to end that civil war in Zimbabwe between the apartheid Rhodesian government and the ZANLA and ZIPRA freedom fighters, that agreement required what would become the majority rule government of the post-colonial dispensation to respect property rights from day one of their administrations. Nonetheless, for almost a century, from 1890 to 1980, Rhodesia's colonial governments had wantonly trampled upon indigenous Zimbabweans' own property rights with complete and united acquiescence of Western nations. And they did this very methodically. First, they studied the climatic conditions in Zimbabwe, and they studied the fertility of the land, and they classified every square inch of land in Zimbabwe into zones 1 to 8. reflecting their agricultural potential. Zone 1 had the most agricultural potential, while Zone 8 had the least agricultural potential. And then through a progressive legislative campaign, starting with the Land Apportionment Act of 1930 through to the Land Tenure Act of 1969, the indigenous Zimbabweans were forcibly expropriated of their lands with no compensation. And the same lands were then gifted to settler Europeans to establish their enterprises. These colonial governments then imposed on the landless, now landless, indigenous Zimbabweans, hut, livestock, and even dog taxes in order to compel the indigenous Zimbabweans to convert from landowners and agriculturalists in their own right to farm laborers on their former lands, now held by European settler enterprises. And the legacy of colonial racialization of access to land in Zimbabwe is that at independence in 1980 from Great Britain, 95% of agricultural land was held by settler Europeans. That comprised only 5% of the population, while the indigenous Zimbabweans were crowded in 5% of lands located in the least agricultural favorable soils and climate. And this set of circumstances, it clearly undermined all hope that any of the human rights guarantees already established by the UN and continuing to evolve could be achieved for indigenous Zimbabweans, whose economy is predominantly agrarian. Well, the West's practice regarding racialization of land use in Zimbabwe is what is perhaps critical for this presentation. The West's attitude towards this post-independence racialized property rights is characterized by the imposition by the West of land policies for the SADC. They must adopt a willing seller, willing buyer exchange of property. Unless the settler Europeans wish to sell the land, the government cannot force them to sell the land, even for redistribution to the landless peasants. This policy of the West is also characterized by the prohibition of the introduction of any other policy for the transfer of land between the landless, a majority, and the ones that control the land without the approval of Western states. This raises the paradox of land rights between the indigenous populations and the settler populations. It also raises the paradox of constitutional authority between the colonial administrations and the majority rule administrations. Some observations here. You see unilateral measures aimed at protecting racialized land use in Zimbabwe or land ownership in Zimbabwe have emerged. The USA, the UA, Australia, Canada, and others have all implemented unilateral coercive measures against Zimbabwe in consequence of Zimbabwe's own constitutional de-racialization of access to land policies. Until November 2014, the EU and its allies had established and maintained unilateral trade embargoes against Zimbabwe as a reaction to Zimbabwe's 2005 Amendment Act, which authorized the majority rule government to take away land without compensation from any that had it in excess. And this was not pleasing This was an act of rejection of the policy of willing seller, willing buyer that the West had imposed upon the majority rule government. And pursuant to Article 215 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and for the purpose of achieving the objectives of the Common Foreign and Security Policy, the 28 member states of the European Union on 18 February 2002 imposed a package of punitive measures in relation to Zimbabwe's new land reform program. These included an embargo on arms and related materials, a ban on exports of equipment for internal repression, a ban on provision of certain services, freezing of funds and economic resources. At a workshop which was held at Geneva on 5 April 2013, the delegation of Zimbabwe observed that since independence in 1980, the EU had been the most important donor to Zimbabwe, especially in the areas of health, education, and agricultural development, contributing millions of euros to various programs. But immediately the Zimbabwe government had instituted the fast-track land reform. The EU withdrew all its support, resulting in an immediate depletion of essential drugs in 73% of Zimbabwe's health facilities. Infant mortality rates immediately shot up, with at least 100 children dying every day from treatable diseases, and at least 8 Zimbabwean women dying every day in childbirth for chronic underfunding of the health sector. But even more, Global Fund made it difficult and most of the time impossible for the country to scale up its HIV prevention programs by rejecting Zimbabwe's applications for funds for unspecified reasons. And the 2010 report of the Zimbabwe National Statistical Agency states that in 2002, for instance, Zimbabwe had an estimated population of 11.6 million people, with a trajectory of rising up to the present 16 million people. And it's noted that, you see, these estimates were conservatives because many of the Zimbabweans had escaped the hardships resulting from these unilateral measures intended to protect racialized land use in Zimbabwe. The economy is experiencing severe shortages of many basic commodities, including drugs, food, fuel, and industrial and consumer goods. In the previous decade, it has also witnessed increasing poverty levels. For instance, the total consumption poverty line, TCPL, rose from 61% in 1995 to 72% in 2003. On 21 December, the USA passed the ZIDERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDERA, as a platform for effecting democratic change in Zimbabwe, which had become lawless regarding property rights. Canada, in 2008, adopted special economic measures, Zimbabwe regulations of 4 September 2008, which also instituted economic embargoes, specifically reacting to the adoption of the fast-track land reform. Australia's autonomous sanctions of 2011, as amended in 2012, also impose sanctions for this fast-track or for the de-racialization of land usage and access to land in Zimbabwe. You see, the consequences of this reaction by Western states to the SADC's attempt to de-racialize land use and access to land and land ownership. have reduced what was once the breadbasket of Africa to a basket case, with Zimbabwe unable to either feed itself or to run an economy with any hope of realizing any of the UN human rights score charts. Well, I'm grateful for having allowed me a very long spell to carry on. I should stop at this stage, and hopefully I have generated sufficient material for further discussion in the next session.
No, thank you very much, Professor. Dear Benedict, you definitely provoked thoughts, at least in the head of a moderator. I have been dealing with human rights issues for more than 30 years. But what you pointed at is really demands rethinking, if you want, in a way, because we all trying to understand how better implement human rights. And maybe the question which you raised in the very beginning, how unresolved legacies of colonialism may undermine human rights law, and I would add its implementation. If we find an answer to this question, maybe it will help better implement human rights. Thank you very much. And now our panelist, David Mounier, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. He works under the Faculty of Humanities at the university. He is an international relations and foreign policy expert who previously served as a section manager, international relations policy analysis at the South African Parliament, providing strategic management, parliamentary foreign policy formulation, and monitoring and analysis services. He also formed part of the South African academic delegations at meetings of India, Brazil, and South Africa Dialogue Forum in 2010, and the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa BRICS summits. He has published widely and is a respected political analyst featuring in the international and national media. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for being so kind. And let me take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this, I must say, very unique webinar. When I was invited, I jumped into it because I think we need more of this at this moment. Thank you, ambassadors, fellow panelists, and it's indeed a great pleasure to join you at this stage. Colonialism is one of the darkest episodes in the history of humanity. It denied basic human rights to the colonized races and regions, and it is fair to say that almost in all places where it occurred, it did so with the genocidal savagery. One can talk about the near total dissemination of Native Americans in the Americas, which was actually sanctioned by colonial fleet. The Belgian rape of the Congo saw millions of natives killed and maimed with criminal impunity. And recently, the Belgian king visited DRC and no apology was rendered. The genocide of the Herero by Germans in the modern day Namibia is another example that my colleagues have also alluded to. That Germany was diverted of its colonial after the First World War and did not mean that the victors of that war had benign intents in terms of controlling of the then Southwest South Africa by South Africa apartheid government. It is not worth that while the United Nations passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1945, the organization was more tailored towards preventing war and establishing peace rather than promoting human rights for all races. In 1945, the UN formed most of Africans was under colonial rule, perpetrated by 2 members of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, Britain and France. General Jan Smuts, who played a key role in crafting the Declaration of Human Rights, was a South African statesman who did not believe that Black South Africans were entitled to the same range of human rights as their white counterparts. This backdrop explains why, despite high-sounding language about human rights from Western powers and their surrogates, the developing world is skeptical. The limited scope of the United Nations made it possible for some of its influential members to continue colonial exploits in the developing world. Kwame Nkrumah spoke about neocolonialism as the last stage of imperialism. To the developing world, homage about human rights appears through they were meant for the benefit of the West. This is starkly seen in the United States Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed the title of inalienable human rights, but still kept African Americans in slavery and bondage. But the framers and exposers of this high-sounding declaration that the greatest champion claiming to be pro-human rights, the lots and lots of human rights abuse within the United States. But at a global level, there's much of a blame game to other countries. These legacies are painfully extend in the developing world and even in the former colonial powers. France still wields enormous influence in its former colonies, as seen from the power of the franc currency over the Francophone Africa. We must mention Haiti and the role of France, which up to today, we still have huge problems in Haiti, a matter that is not being seriously looked at. The installation of puppets regime in developing country is another way in which the former colonizers continue to perpetuate colonial influence. That's the concept of human rights and democracy become silent in developing world because the hypocrisy of the messengers. On one hand, they talk in terms of human rights to an extent that the Biden administration had a summit on democracies, yet atrocities in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya are kept at the back burner without much talk within the Western world. Most of the developing world is committed to entrenching the ideals of accountable governance and the protection of basic human rights, such as the right to life, basic health care, education, and self-upliftment. What the developing world looks is the hypocrisy of former colonial powers over these ideals. Racism has been at the center of denying the developing world their richly deserved human rights. Apartheid South Africa and the settler-ruled Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, something that my colleague has just covered now extensively. In addition, Western fixation with the Cold War belligerents was such that the Western powers were more comfortable with racist regimes that denied African natives their basic rights. For as long as these entrenched white regimes were capitalist and provided a buffer against the spread of socialism. Apartheid has been called colonialism of a special kind, and rightly so. Had a powerful allies in Reagan administration in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. It is that's no wonder that South Africa and the developing world look askance at Western commitment to human rights. It should be noted that some of the most unequal societies in the world are actually found in former colonies. In countries such as South Africa, with the significant demographic of people of Western descent, inequality is mostly along racial lines in favor of European descendants. There has to be acknowledgement, as the United Nations Secretary General has done, that the legacies of colonialism endures and they have an adverse impact on human rights, a question that the ambassador's presentation spoke eloquently on this matter. The West should refrain from being preachy about human rights and acknowledge their internal problems, as I have mentioned, that a lot of human rights violation is happening in the Western world. Racial politics, which almost automatically deny certain citizens the enjoyments of all rights, continue to infect countries such as the United States. Britain's exit from the European Union and its recent initiatives to send immigrants to Rwanda brings to the fore its continued superiority complex to people of non-European descent. The initiative, which has provoked backlash, seems not to pay heed to how the rights of redirected immigrants could be abused in authoritarian countries such as Rwanda. The international community should be a partner to the developing world in providing initiatives that will endanger peace and good governance. This by no means does not excuse the capability of some of actors in the developing world in the abuse of human rights and misgovernance. It is in the increasing globalized world, instability in one part is bound to affect other parts, as we see what is happening in Russia-Ukraine crisis. It has huge implication all over the world, including on the African continent. Practical ways of doing this are by debt cancellation and more investment in sectors such as education, technology for citizens of the developing world. And an enlightened citizens who will scarcely be aware of human rights are being withheld from him or her. On this note, once again, I'd like to thank the organizers for this wonderful topic and the discussions that one hopes it will encourage more discussions so that we have a balanced way of understanding human rights. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, David. I cannot but fully agree with you that we need more of these kind of discussions, more panels on this very issue of the legacies of colonialism and other pertinent issues, also due to its complexity and the comprehensive negative effect of many spheres of life. I read more and more about the negative effect of colonialism on climate change even. I could never imagine that climate change and colonialism could be connected, but there was a recent study, very comprehensive and good study about it. We have about 10 minutes and I see one question in our chat box or rather comment requested from the permanent mission of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. All those colleagues, participants who would like to make a brief comment or raise a question, the chat box is open, or you can raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. And now I give the floor, Kwang Hyung Pang. the Democratic People's Republic of Korea Permanent Mission. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, moderator, for giving me the floor. I appreciate China for organizing this important side event, and thanks to the distinguished panelists for their valuable presentation. The resolution, which has been adopted at the 48th session of the Human Rights Council last year, recognized that the legacies of colonialism in all their manifestations into earlier economic exploitation, inequality among the state, systematic racism, violation of indigenous people's rights, contemporary forms of slavery, damage to cultural heritage, has negative impact on the effective enjoyment of all human rights. The resolution stressed the utmost importance to eradicate colonialism in any forms or manifestation and address the negative impact of legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights, and called for member states, relevant United Nations bodies, agencies, and other relevant stakeholders to take concrete steps to address the negative impact of legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. In this regard, I think that today's society event is very timely and useful to identify the challenges in addressing the negative impact of legacies of colonialism on human rights, and to find ways for overcoming these challenges. Today, one of the main forms and manifestation of a legacy of colonialism is attempt to interfere to the internal affairs of other countries under the pretext of human rights and to change the systems of other countries. It is a well-known fact that the United States and Western countries violate seriously sovereignty and territorial integrity of former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and committed serious violations and abuse of human rights in these countries by military intervention. The United States and Western countries are slandered and attacked the progressive countries such as China, Russia, Cuba, Belarus, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, and my own country with false and fabricated information and put political and economic pressure. The reason is one only that these countries do not follow so-called values of the West. The UN Human Rights Forum, including the Human Rights Council, are being used as tools to achieve the Western despicable political purposes. DPRK categorically rejects all forms of interference of Western countries and reiterates its unavoidable stand in support to and solidarity with our fraternal and friendly countries for their efforts to achieve the social and economic development and prosperity, and to promote and protection of human rights of their people. The DPRK will do best to engage with the international community to jointly eliminate the negative impacts of legacies of colonialism, promote and protect human rights, and enhance the international justice. I thank you.
I thank you very much. I see one hand raised. Olga Vorontsova, I give you the floor, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we do. Please continue.
We would like to thank our Chinese colleagues for organizing today's meeting on such an important topic. We find it especially important to spread knowledge about the causes and consequences of colonialism. And we are convinced that the present and future generations shouldn't forget about this tragic page of world history. One of the ugliest phases of the colonial policy of the European countries and the United States was the transatlantic slave trade. This inhumane policy of the colonial powers laid the foundation for systematic racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia in the countries of the European Union and the United States. Russia fully condemns the policy of colonialism and expresses its support to all people affected by the slave trade. It's time to raise the issue of restoring historical justice and establishing responsibility for the crimes of colonialism. We're convinced that today's event has contributed to the achievement of this significant and important goal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olga, for your statement. We have about 3-4 minutes to wrap up our interesting webinar. Allow me to thank all our distinguished panelists for their presentations, which definitely broaden our perspective on the issues of colonization, colonialism, and the legacies of the colonialism. I thank you all the participants, and we had today about 40 participants from different places, as I could have noticed. I believe that you would agree with me that we had a fruitful and resultful discussion, which would help us to bring this issue forward. And clearly, I would repeat one of the panelists who said that we need more of this to understand better and to resolve the challenges in a better and a constructive way. I would like heartily thank the Permanent Mission of China, our host, who organized this important event, and allow me to quote Nelson Mandela, who said that colonialism and apartheid have left a sharply polarized society. Until we reduce the wide gaps between the educated and the illiterate, the sheltered and the homeless, and very rich and the poor, will continue to be deeply divided. And this is one of the biggest challenges of current situation in the globe. Thank you very much. And our event is over, unless participants or panelists would like to say a few words. We have another couple of minutes. I don't see that this is the case. Thank you once again. The webinar is closed. Thank you. Adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.